Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Renaissance Room podcast. And in today's episode, I am coming on today to just kind of talk a little bit about, the sifting in priorities, right? And in polarity, rather, the conversations that we have today about life paths and choices that we make, right? We kind of spoke about this briefly before. And, I just want to say a big thanks to anybody who's really I don't want to say studied the body of my work, but anyone who's been following me for a long time, because I feel like my thoughts, my attitudes, my perceptions, and the insights that I share are pretty consistent through and through, I remember talking to you guys just a little bit about how people are kind of performing, this like philosophical type of standpoint today, how people were performing depth, how people are using vulnerability. And rather, vulnerability is becoming more common to kind of induce people into the emotional lives and the physical lives of other people, right? So manipulation is kind of becoming the standard, right? The normalization. People are getting very clever. I spoke about how red pill content and how these communities with women and men, right, coming online and kind of sharing their thoughts on how to, get people for their money or, get women to sleep with you or whatever the case may be, how this type of content really set a precedent for a lot of people to be used and to be set up, and people were getting more and more crafty with their manipulation. And as somebody who, does read the Bible and someone who does kind of practice faith, right? I always think this is so interesting because when I say these things, I'm constantly, as I'm voicing it to you, I totally see the parable. I mean, the parable, but I totally see the parallel in everything that I'm saying. So I think that's pretty cool. But anyway, in today's episode, I wanted to kind of come on and talk about, I don't think there is a lesser evil, right? To the paths that we choose in life. I think if you are someone and you're like, man, you honestly, you see this content online when people are like, may this never find me, right? And no one wants, calamity. No one wants hardship in their lives. But I think for a lot of people today, right, the conversations are like, we should be advocating for housing, right? And we should advocate for housing. Like, this is a completely separate issue from the standpoint that I'm going to be making today and the conversations that we're going to have today. But when I think about people and they're like, this is the American dream. This is the thing that's fading from us. This is the thing that we should be fighting for. I would want to kind of interject and say, the thing that we should be fighting for is the evolution of the Homo sapien. Right? Like, I think when it comes to being humans and being organisms, we don't realize the upending and the uprooting of just our lifespans. Human beings are the only organisms that have kind of shifted what they were kind of created and put here to do. Now, I'm not actually coming from a theological standpoint with this. I'm coming from a scientific standpoint, right? This new thing that we kind of do now where it's like, we're advocating for buying houses and we're talking about this, but we're not actually focusing on the ways in which our relationships have totally shifted, right? The ways in which our relationships have completely, taken a toll in how we socialize with one another. And obviously, I don't think I need to really go into depth about that. Like, we obviously know social media has played a huge role, but I think even in how we partner and how we, interact with one another. And I was thinking about this as I was driving today, and I was like, wow, it's kind of crazy, right? Like, what happens to an organism when it doesn't reproduce, right? Like, what happens to an organism when it really forgoes its life cycle, right? The things that it's supposed to do biologically, right? Physiologically, like, what is the end result of that? And I just don't think there's enough research on it. I think that we have a lot of research on, social media. We have a lot of research on the impact of, people not being able to afford the American dream, right? I critique Sean Galloway's work very heavily, but he's been coming up in conversation on my podcast lately. But, we have Sean Galloway and but we don't actually know what the end result of that is, right? And obviously, simply put, the end result of that is adaptability, right? People will just shift and adapt. But those changes that we make, right? And I don't think it's a genetic mutation because we obviously know that would typically have more of honestly, I would say scientific, but I think even, physiologically, I do think in part this is a little bit maybe not a genetic mutation, but I do think that we are changing as human beings, right? And the things that, we would do, and maybe not necessarily, I don't want to say on impulse, because I think impulse gets a bad rap, but instinctively, right? The things that we have instinctively, when we start to forego those things, we start to forego those inclinations, I don't really know what's to come of a person, right? Do you have people who are just kind of numbed out, muted out? Is that what we're seeing today, right? When you think about like rats, and like they have all these studies on rats, and I think obviously they're probably testing rats for this, and there's probably been research, and I'm sure there are studies out there right now. But you take a rat and you start doing all these different studies on the rat, and there's all these different genetic mutations, and you start to see how the rat is no longer operating fundamentally like a rat, but it's operating in response, right, to the adaptations that it's had to make to survive, right? Obviously under the certain studies, right? And usually when you take an organism and you kind of like twist its fundamental essence, right? Its lifespan, you just kind of start toying around and playing with the organism, right? The organism does adapt, but it's not for the better, right? I think with rats, something that I'm thinking about more commonly is like, you see them and they get like super aggressive and they're just like super angry and they're, you know what I mean? Like you've seen that. And I don't know if that's actually me being basing that off of a science fiction, or if that's genuinely what happens when you take certain organisms out of their environment, right? Like the organism is going to adapt, but it's not going to be for the better, right? And it's never going to be restored to its original form, right? Like, yes, as human beings, right, when we forego, reproduction, we forego mating, because that's what you're seeing today, right? We live in this sort of like, individualistic society, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing inherently, but it is when we're fundamentally wired to be in community with other people in a very healthy, real way. Like I see you, you see me, I can hug you, you can hug me, right? I can look into your eyes, right? I feel the warmth of your presence, right? I feel you sitting next to me, you know what I mean? I can hug you and feel the texture of your sweatshirt. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's a lot more engagement going on there versus like being online engaging with people who you don't know, people who, are selling, just not the same, not the same. Right. And so I think I was thinking about this, right? Like bringing it full circle. What happens to people who don't reproduce, and not from the standpoint of like child-free women no, that's not at all what I'm looking at. I'm really looking at it from again, Homo sapien, right? As humans, as organisms, right? We are the only mammoths, I think, who are kind of at this point where it's like we're foregoing reproduction, right? And I think if you do, if you were to compare or contrast, right, in terms of the animal kingdom, I think the ones who don't reproduce, right? I do think on some point, there's not necessarily that they're outcasted, but they do kind of falter, right? Like, and again, this is not a political movement, right? This is not a political agenda. I'm not here to say this is what you need to do. I'm just here to say that I do think there are going to be some changes, right? Relationally, communally, right? Within the human being, right? Within the human, like when you start talking about, well, obviously, I don't know. Because when right, like, for example, if you're not reproducing and you have all these adaptations that have been made into the psyches of people, into the physiological, right, stances of people who haven't been touched, who haven't been, who, are not living within community. If they don't go on to breed, then I guess you'll just have the people who didn't reproduce, these organisms that didn't reproduce, right, these Homo sapiens that didn't reproduce, they would just fall away. But they are going to be inherently and genetically like altered, right? Fundamentally, because they're not operating in what their original creation was, right? Like fundamentally, they're not doing what they were created to do, right? And again, this is not so basic in the sense of like feminism or, let's just, we should just have babies because babies are going to solve the world. No, I'm just talking about it from a scientific standpoint, from an organism standpoint, like human beings as an organism, right? Like a very powerful organism, might I add, but just what happens when you kind of start to have these genetic mutations where people start to adapt physiologically to not being touched, to not be, you know what I mean? And people start to, obviously not have the ability to reproduce, right? Like what happens to that lineage, what happens to those organisms, right, as human beings. And I just don't think it's something that we think about today when people kind of make these arguments or make these assumptions or really, garner these movements of being child free, not because, maybe they're struggling with fertility, right? Because I think there is absolutely, right, like a bevy of research out there about women who've had, struggle with infertility and what happens to them. So I don't want to be insensitive in this conversation and say that people are going to falter or be cast away, right? Because we know that from a historical standpoint, obviously women who could not have children were absolutely casted away, right? Like it was a lot of disregard there. So I'm not necessarily relaying it to that. I'm more so talking about people who are, in this space right now, right? And if I can tie it full circle and talk about it maybe on a more, superficial surface level way, right? And you talk about social media and people kind of like making these choices to forego their anatomy, right? To forego their original functionality. I just don't think people are aware of the repercussions of that. And you could say maybe it's spiritual, like I mentioned my faith, but I think I'm more so just looking at it as, again, just, what happens when you start to alter the lifespan, right? The lifespan, the life expectancy, right? When you start to alter human beings, and what they were created to do. You take away their community, you take away their sense of touch, you take away their sense of connect, their ability to connect, and you start injecting them with all this language that means different things to different people. You know what I mean? That means different things to different people. You start to put, people with third grade understanding, right? Or let me not say that. You start to put third graders in the class with 12th graders. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. And I don't want to call it a genetic mutation because I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that I do think that there is going to be some type of chemical reaction to this. And obviously, like I said, those who don't reproduce, I don't think it's something that we're going to be able to study, and be able to say, oh, okay, this is what happens with this particular population, when this is the result. I think it's more so just studying it on an individual case by case basis. But overall, I don't think it's a good result. I don't think it's a good result. I think there's some serious repercussions to that. And I don't think people realize it. Right. And at a very basic level, being perpetually single, comes with, its own freedoms of logistics, right? You don't have to get anybody ready in the morning. You don't have to worry about, certain things, right? Like there is definitely a sense of, lightness in terms of logistics, right? But there's also this internal burden that you carry that no one can see, right? Because you have had the ability to go about and acquire the American dream and do all the different things because you can move here, you can go there, you know what I mean? You do have the freedom of logistics, but there is something fundamentally within many of these individuals that is deeply unfulfilled and it's broken, right? And it's not broken because, they just listen to society or, because they're just blah, blah, blah. No, it's not broken for any superficial reason or anything that I think we can classify other than the fact that fundamentally you're an organism that was created to reproduce, right? And if you don't have that opportunity, I do think it's going to look different. Like, obviously we know for, maybe for example, like within the animal kingdom, maybe they go off and start killing one another. I don't know. Maybe they just go off and just walk to the end of the earth. I don't know. You know what I mean? But we know that there is going to be some type of deviance, right? There's a deviation from the rest of the animals who have partaken in their life cycle, right? Who have done the things, you know what I mean? They've reproduced, you know what I mean? It's different. It's different. And so when I think about purpose, I'm not trying to simplify anyone's purpose. I think that's one of the beautiful things, obviously, about human beings is that there's complexity. There's so much we can do, yet so little time in which we can do it, right? And even in our attitudes about doing anything and all the different things, there's a lot that kind of goes into that, right? We take it from a very basic level, right? Your education level, right? Where'd you go to school? You know what I mean? Did you really have the resources to actually go off and live this very grand purpose, right? This grandiose sense of purpose and, have this ability to change the world, right? Or are you just kind of stuck with ideas, right? Ideas that maybe, have been propagated from the media, from marketing, from masses, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot there that kind of goes into whether or not you are going to be this like super heroic human being and contribute something massive to society. For many people, that's not the case. And it's not because you're not capable. It's not because you didn't have great ideas, but because human beings in the world in which we're set up in, right? You call it capitalistic, right? Well, it is capitalistic, but our society, there are prerequisites, right? To being able to actually manifest and bring about an idea, right? To get it into fruition is a whole nother set of steps, right? It's not this simple thing as going out and putting out news flyers and having, the science teacher or whoever, right, in your field come over, right, and help you, right? Skilled professionals come over and help you, and you guys put your skills together and you put your minds together and you build something for the greater good. No, it's not like that. You know what I mean? Like there's logistics involved, right? And most people don't have the means, right, to really operate in that way that gives them the freedom and the mobility to monetize their gifts, or get their ideas on the forefront to actually make these very radical changes to society based on their ideas or their inventions or whatever. So how much of it is fluff? How much of it rather is fabricated? Much of it is actually fabricated, if you ask me. So when you start talking about regular everyday individuals and you start talking about them really not being aware that, okay, at the end of the day, yes, there's meaning and all these different things, and meaning is going to be different for you. It's going to be different for me. It's going to be different based on where we come from, based on, what we believe, based on what we were like, there's all these things that really give us meaning, right? And much of meaning is just our ability to define it, right? And it's something that is entirely self-proclaimed, right? It's individualized, right? Your sense of meaning is not my sense of meaning, right? And so much of it is just, based on personal identification, right? For example, things don't have meaning, right? Nothing has meaning unless we give it meaning. And our ability to define or classify something as meaningful is inherently individual. It's inherently specific. It's not the same. Are there people who can be like-minded, who may share the same ideas? Absolutely. But 9 times out of 10, just the way our society is set up, we're young, we're pushed into the labor force. Not many people are really given the opportunity to kind of sit with themselves, sit with life, really explore, spirituality, explore meditation, explore, internal self, sense of being. Like, not too many people have really walked that path, that very narrow path of self-actualization, right? And so when you start to forego these things, I don't know what the byproduct is of that. I don't know what the byproduct is of that. And in contrast, right, people who do have children who don't necessarily take likeness to tending to their cubs, right, who are like, what, I'm just going to kind of leave, and I'm leaving the nest, right, and the babies are going to starve and die, and they're going to be eaten by hyenas or whatever, other predatory animal is up next in the kingdom, right? Like, it's no different than children who are left unattended, right? And that's what you have, obviously, within our capitalistic society. That's the welfare system, right? Child protective services. Did you know that over half Black children are in foster care, right? Taken from their families during the war on drugs, right? Lot I'm learning right now in Dorothy Roberts' Torn Apart book. It's a great book. But yeah, and so you're left at the hands of the system, right? You're left at the hands of whatever humans have created capitalistically. And oftentimes, it's very bad. Right? Simply put, it's pretty bad. And the children are going to suffer. So it's just very interesting, I think, when you kind of look at, what it is when we start to change and shift in language, right? And we start to kind of, and obviously you could say, well, the priorities are shifting. It's more capitalistic. Yeah, of course. I was watching the Lorax yesterday with my kid, and I'm like, yeah, this is right on, right? But I do think that anybody who's listening to this, right, I do think that we have a opportunity to restore humanity, just like in the Lorax, right? Like, we have the opportunity to go out and fight for trees, and we have the opportunity to really shift, and so I don't know, you guys, I just think overall, I just know that what we're doing is evolutionary, but it wasn't evolutionary in the sense that we think, right? It was pretty harmful to our fundamental essence, right, as human beings, and what we were really created to do, and the things that we were just created to be, and just, I think at the end of the day, like I said, we just don't know, right? Because you just don't know what you don't know, but it is dangerous. It is going to be dangerous. I think there are going to be some repercussions, and I don't think that those repercussions are going to be anything that's, of any real benefit, And maybe we don't know, right? Maybe I can't really classify it as simple as good or bad. Like I said, I think that there's just something internally that shifts and that is incredibly heavy in the lives of individuals who forego reproduction, right? And although they have all the capitalistic gains, right, there's just something fundamentally broken within them. And it's the same thing, right? No different than many people who forego, right, actually tending to their offspring. Again, something very internally heavy within them, right? And we often see this manifest as in anger and rage and more dangerous or extreme emotions and behavior, right? More volatile emotions and behavior. So that's my thoughts. And I hope you guys have a great day. This is a great start to start the Monday. What do you think? Peace.